It's Tom Baker month here on the channel. Yes, we here at the Universals are celebrating 50 years of the Fourth Doctor by finally giving him the dedicated themed month that he rightfully deserves. So, let's talk about one of his worst stories, shall we? So, look, I know I usually start off these videos by verbally filleting the subject in question and making them sound like the most important Doctor Who writer, but you genuinely could make the case that Terry Nation is the most important Doctor Who writer, and a lot of people probably wouldn't blame you. If you somehow didn't know, my guy Terry was the creator of the Daleks, the alien fascist battle tanks that catapulted the show into popularity near its very beginning and became something of a cultural phenomenon in and of themselves. I've seen some say that it was Nation who, through the Daleks, spearheaded what would become Doctor Who's overall ethos as a rebellion against oppression, that without his input, it would be a far more passive exercise, and ultimately nothing more than an obscure, short-lived curiosity only remembered by some nerdy counterculture basement dwellers. Affectionate. On that basis alone, many would probably concede that he totally deserves the crown. Others may contest this notion, however, remarking that Nation's writing was actually pretty tropey and one-note, that the strengths of his serials can actually be attributed to the respective script editors that polished them, and that most of the credit for the Daleks' success should go to prop designer Raymond Cusick for giving them such a distinctive appearance that would make them such a marketing juggernaut. Where do I land on this? Well, yes. Carry on. Regardless of your stance there, Nation was still a frequent contributor to Doctor Who's early years, and no matter how often he pits the Daleks against a race of robots or involves nuclear warfare or radiation in his narratives, the majority of them have continued to experience lasting popularity even to this day. Of course, there's the empire of stories that he scripted for the era of William Hartnell's first Doctor, the masterclass of tension that is the original Dalek story, a non-Dalek anthological scavenger hunt in the Keys of Marinus, the rebellion against the apocalypse that is the Dalek invasion of Earth, a goofball Looney Tunes runaround in the form of The Chase, a literal cutaway episode without the Doctor in Mission to the Unknown, which serves as a prequel to the grandiose universe-encompassing Cold War satire The Daleks' Master Plan, the latter of which Nation shared writing duties over with Dennis Spooner. Almost all television outings involving Daleks from 1963 to 1965 were birthed from Nation, and all to immense success and popularity. And in his ideal world, this would probably be where his involvement with Doctor Who ends, because he proceeded to sit out the show for the next 7 years, with any serials featuring the Daleks in that period being penned by other writers, as he sought to earn his creations a solo career, which, well, the Daleks are still in Doctor Who to this day, so you can figure out how well that went. Nevertheless, he eventually came back to Doctor Who, re-establishing himself around its 10th anniversary by penning the perfectly serviceable Planet of the Daleks and Death to the Daleks for John Pertwee's third Doctor in his waning outings, though neither of them fully recaptured the it factor of Nation's prior installments. But then of course he followed those up with what is widely considered to be his magnum opus for the opening season of Tom Baker's Fourth Doctor, Genesis of the Daleks, a pivotal moment in the history of the franchise. This serial involved the Doctor being sent back in time to disrupt the origins of the Daleks for the greater good of the universe. It introduced the Daleks' creator Davros to great fanfare, thoughtfully explored the ethics of altering history, and was generally just incredible. It's gone down as one of the ultimate high points of the classic series and of Doctor Who in general, and for good goddamn reason. It's got stellar world building, plotting, themes, characterization, clams, the whole 9 yards. It's top tier stuff. I kinda hoped this would be the perfect segue into the subject of today's video considering its relevance to Genesis, but Terry had to make it awkward for me and write another non-Dalek script between these two called The Android Invasion. It's alright. This isn't to say that none of the stories I've mentioned so far are a Bad Apples candidate in their own right. I've seen quite a few people who would probably argue that Death to the Daleks is a dud in Terry Nation's output. But today, I'm gonna go for the easiest target. His final script for the show, Destiny of the Daleks. Broadcast in 1979 and coming nearly a full 4 years after Nation's previous entry for the show, Destiny of the Daleks was the first time the titular space fascists had appeared in their own adventure since Genesis of the Daleks. And I suppose, rather naturally, it was decided that this new narrative should be a follow-up to those events. Davros, who had been betrayed and killed by his own creations at the end of his debut outing, would be resurrected and brought back for a narrative where the Daleks are crawling right back to him for Daddy's protection against a worthy foe. Nothing inherently wrong with that idea in concept. I know some are of the opinion that Davros should never have come back, that he would have worked far more effectively as a one-off like Sutek or Morbius, and I kind of get that sentiment. His purist ideology coming back to bite him is not only incredibly powerful commentary about the absurdity of fascist beliefs, but it's also just incredibly difficult to outdo creatively speaking. But at the same time, it all depends on execution. Whether or not they have the right idea to justify continuing his narrative in the show. Heh. Alright, let's get into it. Okay, so how I would usually go about doing this is that I have some preamble where I explore notable aspects of the story in question, mostly positives to give credit where it's due, as if I were seeking to discover the reasons as to why it isn't well received, even though I'm already well aware of those reasons to begin with, but I feign ignorance to make it feel like we're going on a journey of discovery together. It's kind of romantic like that. But in this case, the issues are so obvious and so woven in with the DNA of the adventure that I feel like I have no choice but to just rip the band-aid off right off the bat. This serial has 3 very obvious problems that prevent it from being a success, and I'm going to go through each of them in increasing severity and relevance to Nation. The first of them Terry doesn't really have any influence on, and it might sound superficial to even bring it up, but I do think it is relevant in the perception of this serial. The production is terrible. I know, criticizing a classic Who story for bad production values is cliché and oftentimes unfair, and it must be noted that this particular outing came out around the tail end of the 1970s when the BBC was dealing with inflation and budget cuts, so I do respect that the bar will unfortunately be lower this time around. But even with all that considered, there's still a lot of questionable decision-making and execution here. The direction, for instance. It's all over the shop. Sometimes the framing for certain shots, particularly close-ups, genuinely looks really well staged, but then other times, I can't think of a worse way they could have conveyed a scene. It constantly yo-yos from being an excellent complement to the narrative content to mind-bogglingly amateur. It's so strange. This may also be one of the stories where I'm most aware of the cameraman due to how scrappy a lot of the filming techniques are, and once you notice how much of it is filmed from a low angle, you never unnotice it. Then of course there's the acting of the extras and supporting characters that leave a lot to be desired, though credit to Tim Barlow for being the standout of the cast and giving a decent performance while being deaf at the time of filming. Sometimes the Dalek operators will generally move in horribly unconvincing ways, and David Goodison, bless him, standing in for Michael Wisher as Davros and donning his ill-fitting mask, waddles in his attempts to make Davros's chair move across the room. It's a complete shambles. Well, the explosions look cool. Again, I know Nation has no influence over any of this and thus cannot be held responsible for it. But at the same time, this is meant to be a follow-up to one of the most gritty and engaging Doctor Who serials ever, and this is how it looks. Even if you've got a stellar script, which Nation doesn't here, shoddy production working against your creative vision can absolutely make the difference between greatness and mediocrity. So yeah, by comparison, I get why Destiny of the Daleks may come off as a pretty cheap cheap installment from Nation, despite said cheapness not really being his fault. But of course, as the Doctor says early on in the story, it's what's on the inside that matters. So yeah, sure, this serial may look a bit naff, but let's look past external appearances and take a look at the actual narrative content. Well, this is where the second problem arises. See, as mentioned earlier, many critics of Nation are of the firm belief that his success with Doctor Who is largely built on the numerous script editors of his respective serials doing all the work, and Terry ultimately getting all the credit since, well, it's his name next to the title card. I bring this up because regardless of how drastic these rewrites potentially were, in most cases they did still ultimately succeed in complementing Nation's ideas and creating tonally cohesive narratives. Destiny of the Daleks, meanwhile, not so much. The script editor during its creation was a certain Douglas Adams, and to be blunt, Douglas Adams' whimsy and Terry Nation's sci-fi go together about as well as corned beef with a packet of Starburst. As a result, this serial develops quite a bit of tonal whiplash. On one hand, you've got some gritty ideas that very much feel born from Nation, like the Daleks possessing labour forces comprised of survivors and prisoners from their previous conquests, who are forced to bury their dead in rubble and, in a later scene, are lined up for execution to make the Doctor comply with the Daleks' demands. But then conversely, it often feels like the serial is taking a rather flippant attitude towards its own narrative. No better exemplified by the Doctor repeatedly breaking out into Adams-esque witticisms and cartoony antics that just clash with the rest of the dialogue and character work. Quips about the Galactic Olympics, Napoleon, and origins of the universe, taunting the Daleks for their lack of mobility, pushing an indignant Davros around with minimal caution, and saving the day with a hat toss and an arm wrestle. And that's to say nothing of the entire opening sequence with Romana's regeneration. It doesn't feel like a natural ebbing and flowing of tension, it just feels like the story is at war with itself on what level of sincerity it should have. And again, on a comparative note, being a follow-up to the consistently grim-dark genesis of the Daleks makes the tonal confusion here even more apparent. So the production sucks and Dougie Adams didn't really get the vibe. That's not great, but Terry Nation isn't really at fault here, is he? I mean, sure, this certainly is a dud for him, but that's more due to outsider interference than anything else, yeah? Well, now we come to the biggest problem with the serial, and one that is primarily down to Nation. So, Daleks versus Movellans, am I right? Yeah, anyone who's watched this serial knows what I'm about to get into here. As I said earlier, the Daleks are back on Skaro digging up Davros because they need his help to win a conflict they're stuck with. They are at war with their most worthy opponent yet, disco robots. The Movellans are Nation's new mechanical race for the Daleks to do battle with, and despite having one of the most easily exploitable weaknesses imaginable, they have got our angry battle tank boys locked in a stalemate. You see, both races are struggling to gain an advantage over the other because both of their armies are coordinated by battle computers which are enslaved to cold, hard logic. Neither side is making a move because they are both predicting the optimal moment to attack, which simply isn't coming because of how evenly matched they are. And neither side has the capacity to think outside the box in this feud because they are both races of robots who are, in themselves, enslaved to logic. This is why the Daleks have come back grovelling at Daddy's feet. Or balls, rather. They want Davros to modify their battle computers so that they finally have an advantage. Apparently, this logical stalemate was the basis for Nation's commission. Douglas Adams and producer Graham Williams had suggested this particular idea for him to build on with the Daleks in mind, and Nation thought Davros would be a natural complement to it. Now, believe it or not, there are some neat aspects to this state of affairs. The concept of the logical impasse is pretty cool in and of itself, as are the circumstances of the actual plot continuing said impasse. Just as the Daleks think they've gained an advantage by having Davros reprogram their battle computers, at the same time the Movellans are hoping the Doctor will do the same for them, keeping them evenly matched. That's actually pretty clever. Okay. why are the Daleks robots now? Yeah, this is the controversial part. For this whole premise to work, the Daleks and the Movellans have to be on a level playing field, and so it was decided that by this point in their history, the Daleks had shed any remnants of their organic heritage and became completely robotic. This is an intentional and deliberate story decision. Nation didn't just forget how his own creations work, and this begs the question. From an in-universe perspective, why? Why would the Daleks evolve in this direction? It has to have been a choice on their part. A race so emphatically obsessed with their own purity doesn't just accidentally let themselves go like this. And to anyone who might say I'm taking the robot thing too literally, the plot wouldn't work if they were just regular mutant-operated Daleks, because then there would be no impasse. They'd be smart enough to solve this issue themselves without Davros's help. But jettisoning their Khalid roots entirely just flat out doesn't line up with their ideology at all. Admittedly, any explanation as to why they'd choose to do this would be a huge pill to swallow, but we don't even get one. This is just what they are now for this adventure, and it's treated as normal, which I suppose is arguably better than lampshading it like they do with the Cybermen in The Timeless Children, though that's literally a whole other story. Hell, the Doctor actually seems taken aback when he recalls that the travel machines used to house Khalid mutants inside them. It feels like we're missing a vital step in the Daleks' history here, which, again, really doesn't do this outing any favours when it's meant to be a sequel to Genesis of the Daleks, a serial which very explicitly emphasised the mutant component and the purity dogma of the Khalids. And of course, as a creative direction, it's kind of just the antithesis of what makes the Daleks compelling in the first place. The fact that they are so much more than robots and are scarily ingenious with how they go about ensuring their goal of superiority. Something that every other Dalek story up to this point, penned by Nation or otherwise, understood. Yes, even the dumber ones like The Chase and Death to the Daleks. It's just baffling, and I don't get why Nation took this route. And it's a shame because despite being massively out of character for the Daleks themselves, it does highlight something about Davros that does justify his continued existence. Because remember, Davros was betrayed by the mutant-operated Daleks, but these purely robotic Daleks are fiercely loyal to him. These same robotic Daleks that are enslaved to logic to a fault and are unable to win a war against disco robots. It communicates the fact that Davros can never truly win. The scarily intelligent Khalid mutants will always betray him on the basis of purity, but he can't rely on the loyal robot Daleks either because they aren't effective without that organic Khalid thought process. It's a catch-22, in itself an impasse which Davros cannot truly escape. That's such a cool idea, but there are much better ways of demonstrating it. Say if Davros had orchestrated this scenario with robot Daleks himself instead of just falling into it by chance. That way the Daleks don't end up contradicting their own ideology for no defined reason, and Davros would be justified in trying it because of the sense of betrayal that he should feel. It would basically be like a precursor to the 80s Dalek trilogy, because as is in the actual narrative, Davros doesn't seem too hung up about the fact that his own creations had turned on him. In concept, you could say that communicates the intensity of his beliefs, that even his own creations' transgressions don't dissuade him from his ideology, but in execution it just comes off more like he's just kind of a doormat to them. Oh yes, Senpai Daleks notice me. Yeah, he has his moments here, but he's nowhere near as deep or complex as he was in his debut, and that's a shame, and I do sympathise with the people who think he should have stayed a one-hit wonder. I've spent so long on the topic of robot Daleks because honestly, there's not really a whole lot else to talk about beyond what I've already discussed. The logical impasse between the Daleks and Movellans kinda just eats up the entire narrative, which is impressive because for a 4-parter, the pacing of Destiny of the Daleks is glacial. Davros only turns up about halfway through the serial, and we don't fully find out the reason why the Daleks need his help until episode 4. Now, I don't mind that, I do prefer prefer slower pacing. It allows for more thorough world building, or at least it does in theory, because aside from the aforementioned labour forces who are mostly just set dressing, this story is shockingly deprived of it. This is yet another way in which it pales in comparison to Genesis of the Daleks, or really most of Nation's other stories. Those other narratives have far more going on in them outside of the main plot, and so I'm just left wondering what happened here. I guess it's Lala Ward's debut as Romana, but she doesn't really get all that much to do. Well, aside from kicking a Movellans arm clean off, she did not skip leg day. And it is always powerful stuff seeing the gravity on the Doctor's face whenever he learns the Daleks are near, but as mentioned earlier, with the tonal confusion of Adam's script editing mostly manifesting in him, his attitude to the situation is kind of all over the place in an unnatural feeling way. I think I'm hitting the end of this discussion now. I genuinely cannot think of anything else to say. Destiny of the Daleks has a strong nugget of an idea buried deep in there. It pinpointed a fairly decent method of continuing Davros' narrative in the show, and it's certainly onto something, but the concept is completely misfired through questionable narrative choices on Nation's part when it comes to incorporating the Daleks into the commission premise, some ill-fitting script edits by Adams which stick out like a sore thumb, and some bizarre decision-making by the crew when trying to accommodate for the unflattering production values. Unlike most of Nation's other stories, Destiny of the Daleks doesn't feel like a cohesive product, instead more like it's barely being held together by hot glue and tape, not unlike some of the Daleks on set, I'm sure. And sadly, it's the note that Terry Nation ends on with Doctor Who, as he'd moved to Los Angeles around the same time and would never significantly contribute to the show again. That's a shame, but in the end, I've got to tell it how it is. This is a bad apple for Terry Nation, and it is his worst script as far as I'm concerned. Oh well. Now to die unconvincingly.